I thought it might be useful to do an overview of the 8 different parts of speech in the English language. And I think this is important because, first of all, when you're studying parts of speech, it's often easy to kind of lose track of the big picture. And also, if you want to move on to something like sentence structure, then it's great to have a quick review, a kind of refresher. Or if you're really brave, you can jump in at the deep end of the pool, start with this, and then right away move on to sentence structure. Now, I can't deal with every last aspect of parts of speech, but we're going to try to do our best to cover the highlights. Let's start with nouns here, and we can make a distinction between 2 types of nouns. So we have what's called a proper noun. Okay, so a proper noun, as opposed to a common noun. So steak here would be a common noun. And a common noun is just any generic person, place, thing, or idea, whereas a proper noun is a specific one. Right? So there's one individual here named Bob, whereas steak can stand for any steak, basically. So common nouns are not capitalized unless they start the sentence, whereas proper ones are. Again, I want to emphasize that a noun can also be an idea, can be fairly abstract, and as we will see, sometimes parts of speech can take on other functions. So a noun can even act a bit like an adjective, and a verbal can act like a noun, and so on and so forth. But we'll see some examples of this, so not to worry about it at this stage. There are some other nouns here as well. So for instance, vegetarian here is a noun. In the second sentence, temperatures, tomato plants, plan, and so on and so forth. So lots of nouns here, and they are kind of the building blocks of language. The next part of speech is the pronoun, and a pronoun stands in the place of a noun. So for instance, here we have he. Okay, that's a pronoun. And a pronoun typically refers back to a noun. In this case, it refers back to Bob. And the word for this noun that comes before, this is called the antecedent. The antecedent, there we go. The noun that comes before the pronoun. It's not always easy to find the antecedent, though. Sometimes it seems to be missing, especially with the word it. But for the most part, we can try to kind of figure out what the pronoun stands in the place of. So we've done 2 parts of speech, nouns and pronouns. It's going to get more complicated here now because we're going to move on to verbs. And when it comes to verbs, there are a bunch of different types that are important to recognize. If we look here, for instance, where it says he will make, okay, we got a couple of verbs working together. Will here is what we call a helping verb. Okay, and these helping verbs, they work with the main verb in the verb clause to make this larger unit. So in this case, make here is really the main verb, and will is helping out. Now make here is what we call a transitive verb. Okay, transitive verb, as opposed to an intransitive verb. So an intransitive verb does not have a direct object, whereas a transitive verb does have a direct object. So if we say will make what, then we say an exception. Exception, by the way, is also a noun, in case you're curious. Kind of skipped that one before. So in this case, we can call make a transitive verb. If we say something like Bob laughs, okay, so Bob laughs, then laughs is intransitive. So this would be intransitive, okay, because it does not have a direct object. And in some cases, we can have verbs that can be transitive or intransitive depending on the context, depending on what they're doing in the sentence, if they take an object or not. And by the way, these words like object and subject and so on, they are not parts of speech, but they are other ways to think about the function of the words in the sentence. Now, we have 2 kinds of verbs then, transitive and intransitive, but there's a subcategory of intransitive verbs, and these are called linking verbs. In fact, we have one here. This is a linking verb. And the idea with a linking verb is that it ties together the subject to something that describes it. And the thing that comes after the linking verb is normally a noun or an adjective. So in this case, the word is vegetarian. Vegetarian describes Bob. Vegetarian, as we saw, is a noun. Okay, there we go. It's a noun. And so that's the construction here. But we could also just use an adjective. We could say Bob is happy, and then happy describes Bob. So linking verbs are a fairly small category, but they are kind of important because they function slightly differently. Okay, most of the linking verbs are going to be forms of to be or become, but there are also a bunch that are related to the senses, to smell and to taste and so on. Okay, so that gives us some information about verbs. Now I want to talk about a subcategory of verbs that we call verbals. And let's just scroll down a bit here. So verbals. Oops, I guess we got the wrong color here, if it matters to you. So verbals, these are words that are derived from verbs, and they will never be the main verb of the sentence unless they have a helping verb with them. Okay, so we have three types of verbals. We have present participles, first of all, present participles. There we go. And these always end in ing, like smoking and taking and loving and so on. Then we have past participles. These are a little bit harder to spot. Most of the time they end in ed, as in kicked, laughed, and so on. But sometimes with irregular verbs they are a little bit different. For instance, seen. If we say I see, I saw, I have seen, then we get the past participle seen. And then we also have infinitives. And these are easier to recognize again because they're always to plus the verb. Okay. In fact, you can see one right here, right? We have to swim. That's an infinitive. If we look further up, we also have a present participle here, freezing. And in this case, the present participle is acting like an adjective. When we describe a noun, then we use an adjective. So what kind of temperatures? The freezing temperatures. What you can see then is that these verbals are quite good at taking on different roles in the sentence. So they can act as part of the verb phrase, right? But they can also be adjectives or even kind of by themselves to create smaller phrases. There are lots of things that they can do, and it's really good to be aware of their different functions. Okay, so that's it for verbals for now. Let's move on to adjectives. As we said, freezing is an adjective, and it's fairly easy to add adjectives because we just find a noun. Sorry, I lost the screen here. We just find a noun and we try to describe it. For instance, vegetarian is a noun, and if we say what kind of vegetarian, we can say a fervent vegetarian. So anytime you have a word that describes a noun like that modifies it, we're dealing with an adjective. There's a subset of adjectives that are called articles. Okay, so articles. This is one way to classify these words. These are also called determiners sometimes. But these are words, there are just three of them. They are the, and un. And the last two are just variations of the same word. So because they tend to come before the noun, right? They go with the noun. We tend to classify them as adjectives, or we can simply call them articles. So we've dealt with 4 parts of speech now: nouns, pronouns, verbs, and adjectives. Let's move on to adverbs. And this, I think, is in many ways the hardest part of speech. So I will scroll down a bit here, and we'll sort of do this on its own slide. Adverbs typically, they typically end in ly, right? But not necessarily. Some adjectives can also end in ly. For instance, if we say she was lonely. So this is a clue, but it doesn't necessarily indicate that we're dealing with an adverb. Adverbs tend to do one of 5 things. So most of the time they're going to describe the verb. Okay, so they describe the verb. All right. For instance, we might say Bob often laughs. And in this case, if we ask the question, how or when does he laugh, then we answer it with often. So often is the adverb. It gives us some more information about the verb. By the way, some instructors like to focus on the questions that you should ask to find the adverb, like how and when and how much and so on. That is useful, but I think it's better to think about what they modify, what they're actually changing in the sentence. So verbs are one thing. Adverbs can also modify adjectives. Okay, so they can also modify adjectives. As an example, we can say that somebody is really old. And if we say how old, then we say really. So there is our adverb. We can modify other verbals, which is pretty cool. So other verbals, if we say, for instance, laughing angrily, then angrily is modifying the verbal, the present participle, laughing. Then we have other adverbs, which is surprising perhaps. So adverbs can modify adverbs. If we say too much, then too is modifying much, which is often an adverb. Okay, there's one more, and we actually had it in our sentence before, so we might as well scroll back up. This is the word unfortunately, and this is the last use of the adverb where we modify an entire sentence. Unfortunately is not referring to a specific word necessarily, but it's modifying the entire sentence that follows. So those are adverbs. Let's move on next to prepositions. And let's pick a different color here. Let's go with some kind of blue. We have a preposition at the end here, across the lake. And a preposition is a structure word that relates another word to the rest of the sentence. The word is typically something that follows. So here we have across the lake, and we have lake, which is a noun, as the object of the preposition. Okay, so lake can be classified as a noun, but it's also the object of the preposition. There we go. And together this forms the prepositional phrase. And a prepositional phrase is extra information in the sentence. It's not usually your subject or your object or things like that. You can often put it in parentheses and the sentence will function fine without it. So when you are taking apart a sentence, it's a great idea just to put these little expressions in parentheses. All right, so prepositions are often to do with space and time. Okay, space and time. There's a few other ones as well, but as you can see here, this is a spatial preposition, across the lake. It gives us an indication of where it is. Whereas in an expression like in the morning, we would be dealing with a preposition of time. Next, we'll talk about conjunctions. Now, there are three types of conjunctions, and we see a couple of them in these sentences. The first type that we'll talk about is called the subordinating conjunction. Okay, subordinating conjunction. There's one here. So subordinating. And the idea with these is that we make one part of the sentence less important than another. We tie it to something else. Conjunctions are always about tying parts of the sentence together. In this case, we're saying, although this, Bob is a fervent vegetarian, although this, we also have this, and it keeps going. Okay? And that means that the second part of the sentence is the independent clause. It's the important part. It can stand by itself as a sentence. We can say he will make an exception for steak. And the first part, because it has although here, although is now making this dependent. It's making this first part not quite as crucial. Although Bob is a fervent vegetarian. Well, we can't have that as a complete sentence, right? There are lots of these subordinating conjunctions. They are words like if and although and because and so on and so forth. The second category of conjunction is very small. It's what we call a correlative conjunction. and we have one in the second sentence here. Not only, but also. So what we see here is that these conjunctions are working together. Okay, they're working together as a tag team, you might say, and they're tying different parts of the sentence together. The last type of conjunction is what we call a coordinating conjunction. Okay, so a coordinating conjunction. Coordinating. There are 7 of these, and I think it's really worth memorizing them. So these are and but, nor, for, and or, and so, and yet. All right. They tie together equal elements. For instance, the word and we can use to tie together two nouns, let's say, Bob and Martha. We can tie together 2 big clauses if we like. There are lots of things we can do with coordinating conjunctions. Now, when it comes to conjunctions, there's another subcategory that's important to know about, and we call these conjunctive adverbs. Okay, so conjunctive adverbs. Adverbs. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here, but basically these are words that don't tie together parts of the same sentence, but they tend to tie together different sentences or clauses that are separated by a semicolon, let's say. These are words like moreover, and however, and nevertheless, and so on and so forth. So it's important to know about these because what people often do is they use them in the middle of a sentence and then they create a grammatical problem because they're not using them properly. Our last part of speech is the interjection. The interjection. Okay, interjection. And all this is an expression of emotion. If I say, oh, or ouch, or wow, and the list goes on. It's hard to classify these words as a different part of speech, so we call them interjections, and they're fairly easy to spot typically, so not much to worry about here. Those are the 8 different parts of speech. This is a whirlwind tour, but I hope that you find this useful as you try to figure out how sentences operate and function. And if you want more information, you can always dig into a particular part of speech and learn a bit more about it.